Thank you so much for that introduction. I'm sure you made me sound far more interesting than I actually am. So my talk today, as you can see from the title screen itself, is about why foreign policy matters. So I would like to begin by asking all of you here, what comes into your mind when you think of the word foreign policy? Perhaps you think of big people, buildings like the United Nations, or perhaps your mind drifts off to places in other corners of this world, like Gaza or Ukraine. Now, all of these ideals aren't untrue, but the key element to understanding what foreign policy is in the word itself, and that's the word foreign. So I would like to begin this talk by talking about something Dr. Jaishankar recently posits in his new book. In the India Way, Strategies for an Uncertain World, Dr. Jaishankar says something quite beautifully, and it summarizes exactly why I want to give this talk in the first place. He says, indifference to global developments is no longer affordable. In fact, it is downright dangerous. To most people, however, foreign policy, but its very nature, tends to be focused on the foreign part. It evokes feelings of distance and divergence. It implies people who speak, think, and act differently than us. All of that may be true, but the growing reality today is that foreign policy has reached our very homes. So what does Dr. Jaishankar mean by foreign policy at our doorsteps? And believe me, it is an extremely valid question. For years at this point, I have garnered an interest in this field. And for a lot more of those years than none, I thought this was simply nothing than a pursuit of knowledge, a passion, something I could use to draw parallels in debates and MUNs. But over the years, I found myself wanting to be a part of this world, to be in the next Raisina dialogue, to be in the next Shangri-La, to lobby for my country's goals in the UNFCCC, or at least to be in the Indian embassy somewhere in another corner of this world. While this dream is unconventional, it forced me to look at the conventionalities. It forced me to realize the practicality. And it made me question, why are people paid to do this in the first place? I mean, don't get me wrong, but what does actualizing my country's foreign policy even mean? So that is what my talk is going to talk about today. And more than that, I want to explore why global awareness to foreign policy matters, especially in the Indian context. So let me begin with a little exercise. And let's try to understand what is foreign policy. Because international relations is so fluid, definitions often change. So let's try to cover all bases and keep this talk as objective as possible. By its very nature, foreign policy includes everything. It includes the way our country actualizes its goals, the way it negotiates, the way it implies its ambitions. Sounds simple enough, right? I know it doesn't. So what does foreign policy actually entail in the real world? Is it a military exercise between India and the US? Is it speaking out at the UNGA as a representative of your country? Is it hosting the G20, something India actually recently did and something I'll explore more in this talk? Is it bilateral dialogues? Is it creating embassies? Is it setting up FTAs or free trade agreements? The answer is that it is all of the above. Because foreign policy is this umbrella term for every way we interact with the world. But more importantly to me, foreign policy constitutes every way our country interacts in a manner that affects the average citizen. So let's try to explore the average citizen aspect of this further in this talk. The point of India's foreign policy, at the expense of repeating Dr. Jaishankar again, is to make sure every Indian feels like we have their back. That's a funny visual there, the passport telling us that they have our back. Now, domestic policy and foreign policy are quite different. And I'm sure all of us here today are conscious and active citizens. We know, by the time I came here, you could realize what foreign policy by its very nature entails. We also know it is very different from domestic policy. So you might be wondering, if I'm here talking about how much foreign policy matters to us, how is it actually affecting somebody like you and I? How is it affecting somebody who lives beyond the borders of an embassy or a consulate? So let's explore that further. We see two countries here, and we'll get to them a little later. Because firstly, I would like to consider a broader implication. Domestic policy changes like interest rates or a new toll tax. We can see them, we can feel them, and we can observe them. But what about foreign policy? Can we observe changes in foreign policy? I think we can. Because when a dealing or an interesting relation is striked between the Shenzhen countries and India, and it makes it easier for you and I to apply for that visa and plan our next European summer abroad, it may not strike you as a result of India's foreign policy, but it is certainly a successful outcome of one of our dealings. But this is a very simple example. Let's extrapolate further and go more in depth. Let's discuss Ukraine in the most objective and purely diplomatic perspective ever. So we see the two countries here. We've all heard about what's happening in Ukraine. In fact, at this point, we've heard about it in papers, seen it debated on news channels for more than 2 years at this point. So why am I talking about it now? Because I am here to tell you that there is a drastic impact that we do not realize. You might be thinking, how can that be? This conflict is 5,235 kilometers away from me. How is something that is happening in Ukraine not less than just a fact or something about global history I will pass on in the future? So let's consider what it really does. This was the case in 2022. We all know what happened to Ukraine in 2022. But what happened to India as a result of this conflict is something which is further less discussed. Let me begin with an example. Let's think of a common cooking staple. Perhaps you think of edible oil. So we all know that India is an import-dependent country. And during the time of this conflict, it used to import approximately around 2.5 million tons of sunflower oil, the same oil we use to feed our families. Now, what proportion of this do you think Ukraine contributed? And what proportion of this did it impact the Indian scenario? Let's take a pause here and really think about it. Because even before this talk, I was surprised myself. So even an educated guess would be along the lines of something like, let's see, Eastern European country, quite small. Not really the thing I think of when I think of oil. So what? 2% of the total, 10% of the total. Anything higher than that? It was actually 70%. Much more than half of the oil, the sunflower oil, which we use to run our households, you and I every day, it came from Ukraine. So as a consequence of this entire scenario, we saw a 45% global price hike in sunflower oil prices. And it affected people like us more, people who were far more dependent on these countries, which is exactly why the policies of our country affect the average citizen. Because inflation knows no borders. And the world today is so interconnected that what happens in Kyiv will always come rolling back down to New Delhi, sort of like a butterfly effect. But oil is just one commodity. What about daily items? All daily items, almost all, from poultry to fertilizers, everything that we use to run our economy on a day-to-day saw a drastic increase in price. And it took a long time for the real common world, for India to recognize why this was happening and why we could stop it. The economists knew, the diplomats knew, but what about people like you and I? And it wasn't just inflation. Financial markets wiped out lakhs and crores of Indian rupees a few days after the conflict, all because of our dealings with another country, which again is more than 5,000 kilometers away from us. So take a look at some of the headlines. We can clearly see how a conflict so far away from us can really impact us. And in the long term, why foreign policy matters. Because it matters to people like you and I. Let's sit on this file. Let's sit on these titles for a little while. Let's see that everywhere the target affected population is Indians. It is Indians who have cut down on necessities. It is Indians who were stuck in Ukraine. It is Indians who were the food security vulnerable population. And that is why a global awareness and impact of foreign policy matters today. So let's take a look away from Ukraine. Let's consider Russia. So Russia, like another country quite far away from us, but a little more well known to us. We all know how the global world reacted to Russia. We know that words like sanctions, condemnation, peace talks, and negotiations became commonplace. And speaking of these sanctions, as the Russian economy was sanctioned, Indians were hit even harder. And Indian diplomacy was at a crossroads. Because a global narrative was asking all of us to isolate Russian economy at the expense of peace. On the other hand, Indian households, the very livelihoods, the very economies, the very supply shocks our country depended on would have had to be sacrificed if we had called for full isolation. So what did India do? By the optimism of my talk, I think you can understand that we chose to do the latter. But how did we pull that off? That is something we have to consider. For context, let's see that in 2002, around $1 billion or so was our trade. By 2012, it was $11 billion. By 2025, we had set a target for $30 billion. Do we know what happened in 2022? At the surprise of the entire world and Indian economists themselves, we reached $50 billion in trade in 2022 itself. So not only did we reach our target, we almost doubled it, and we reached it quite a few years prior. This never really happens. So how did India pull this off? This is because of India's change in diplomacy, because even as the world changes, India changes more. For us to understand this, we are going to have to understand the evolution of India's foreign policy. So a very brief story and recap as it is. These are two photos behind me, taken within a gap of 60 or so years. Considering our nation is less than 100 years old, in fact, this makes or summarizes quite a lot of India's foreign policy. The 1961 photo is from a Serbian conference, the Belgrade Conference. We can see a former Prime Minister, Mr. Nehru, alongside the likes of new developing nations who were trying to create a voice in their world. And this was the birthplace of the non-alignment movement, or NAM, something which we've heard about in passing. By its very name, we can understand what NAM really was doing. It was the genesis of Indian foreign policy, but a policy which is starkly different from the one we see on the right. Non-alignment in such a world where we only had two sides meant that we stuck to neither. But more dangerously so, it also meant that we never interacted with the world. It wasn't until the 91 reforms that we actually opened our economy. And that is when real foreign policy began. So take a look at the photo on the right of us. That is the photo from the G20 India hosted last year. Now this G20 was celebrated a lot for a lot of diplomatic and political reasons. But I am not here to discuss those. I am here to discuss two diplomatic victories which I think should become mainstream victories. The first one is the New Delhi Declaration. It was only under the presidency of India that for the first time we reached documentation on what was happening in Ukraine. So not only is this a big victory for the entire world, it is a big victory for Indians. But secondly, the New Delhi Declaration did something which is very fewly done in documentations. For the very first time, India lobbied for a voice of the global south in a documentation. There is a global north and south divide, one of equity, one of technological balance, and one of incomes. And for the very first time, India's presidency allowed newly developing and developing nations to put forth their voice in a documentation that still reverberates across the world. And it allows countries like ours, along with the rest of Southeast Asia and continents such as Africa, to have a voice in this world on a real, tangible level. And this means we have a voice in the world on a real, tangible level. Secondly, the 2023 G20 summit was extremely important for the second reason, that is, we included the African Union. For years at this point, groupings such as the G20 or the G7, some of the largest and most influential countries on this planet, an entire continent has been ignored as a member. We have invited them as invitees, and perhaps observer nations. But it was only under India's presidency that we actually brought them forth as members. Now, why should this matter to you and I? Now, while this is an extrapolated idea, it is something that really matters to people like you and I who want our future to be a global democracy. It is because India is currently fighting for UNSC reforms. We are trying to be a permanent member of the Security Council. And what this leads to is greater diplomacy, it leads to greater action, and it leads to a more resolute balance in the future for you and I. So we can see clearly that over the years, India has changed a lot. And this exact change is what catalyzed us to walk past the diplomatic tightrope that the Russia and Ukraine conflict allowed us to do. Because if we bring back to what happened, we know that the global world had isolated Russia. So how can we, as some of the biggest Southeastern allies of peace, of democracy, how could we continue to trade? And that is exactly because of this policy we call strategic autonomy. Because in today's interconnected world, India is finally making a place for itself. We can leverage military ties with the US while simultaneously trading with one of its biggest oppositions. As the world faces and used to face an energy acute shortage, India capitalized. It traded Russian rubles for Russian oil. It began settlements in rupee when the entire payment system, SWIFT, isolated Russia. And it sounds very easy when I say it here. It sounds quite easy to say that let's try to have the best of both worlds. But the amount of diplomatic pressure a country like India comes under, especially when it is a new power, a power trying to create its space in the world, that is something impressive. It is something no country has ever really so beautifully pulled off before, especially in a time which is so interconnected as of today. So this entire story, this evolution of India's foreign policy, it is a story about us. It is a story of how Indians have changed, because it is only Indians who make our country forward. This story of international relations, this entire example of Ukraine, it is just one example of the way our country interacts with the world, but it is a beautiful one in that, because it clearly shows how foreign policy matters. So I urge you all, I ask you all, to be more globally aware, to be more globally sound, to actively participate, debate, discuss ideals around the world, and try to see what an intricate balance of the world India stands in today. Because it is only then we can revolutionize our country from a local to a global democracy. The world of international relations is tough. It is quite unpredictable, and outcomes happen which are not necessarily the ones we are hoping for. But all we can do as nations, as countries, as citizens of those very countries, is that we can ensure the torch burns a little bit brighter when we pass it on to the next generation. So to all the students here today, to people like me, and to the people, everybody who's in the audience today, we need to ensure that India's diya burns a little brighter in the future. And that can only happen if we recognize that global dynamics have indeed reached us all. And it is only when you and I, people like you and I, recognize how important foreign policy is in the mainstream discussion that India becomes important. So may you be a doctor, an engineer, an industrialist, educator, student, teacher, global dynamics have reached all of us. And if you begin to recognize the world from this perspective, you will see how much more it can affect us. Because Ukraine is just one example. There are conflicts happening around the world. There are diplomatic ties happening all around the world. And all of them impact us. So if there is one thing I urge all of you to take away from this talk, it is to recognize that diplomacy trickles down into every section of society. Thank you.